This is Terry Wagar. This is my vlog for August 17th, 2015. The time right now is about almost 3:20 in the afternoon. I am recording this vlog because pretty much the vast majority of my vlogs is pretty much all about me being a victim of organized crime and organized sting operations, and I'm a victim of being poisoned, and I was being framed for crimes by my wife and by everybody on my wife's side of the family, and by my wife and her side of the family's buddies and lovers in law enforcement here in Portland, Oregon. I became victimized by a very organized sting operation, of which my wife and every member of her side of the family joined into, and it was essentially a murder conspiracy on their part, and people died from it. People were murdered by these people, and I'm one of their victims, and they were attempting to set me up to get the blame. I knew very little about sting operations at the time. I didn't even perceive what was going on at the time as a sting operation. I just perceived it as, well, a couple of bad apples in law enforcement were palling around with us, sleeping around with my wife and people on her side of the family, and they decided to just get rid of me by setting me up for crimes. And they were literally committing crimes, and they were doing so with the intent of setting me up to get the blame. And they were doing this with the intent of getting rid of me. And so that's essentially how I perceived it. I perceived it basically as just a bunch of bad apples in law enforcement, and people such as my wife and her side of the family that were palling around and sleeping around with these people. I didn't actually deem it or view it at the time as a sting operation. It was a sting operation. I just didn't deem it as such. I didn't recognize it as such. I knew very little about sting operations, even though I've been witness to sting operations on and off all my life. I have since taken the time to learn about sting operations and to learn about police and county sheriff sting operations and to learn about their tactics. And the reason why is because most average normal people know virtually nothing about police and county sheriff sting operations. It's amazing the amount of people that usually join into a sting operation is daunting. And I had no idea that law enforcement uses these covert tactics for framing people and for committing crimes and for setting their targets up to get the blame and stuff like that. I had no idea this kind of stuff even took place in this country here in the United States. I was shocked to discover this. I have been a victim of police and county sheriff sting operations on and off all my life. Didn't really realize it until in the latter part of my life, and I was quite shocked and surprised to discover how organized people in law enforcement are, and how their buddies and their relatives and their girlfriends and whatnot, how they all join in with police and county sheriff officers in the targeting of their targets. It's very fascist. It's very extremely fascist. They're very corrupt, and they're very organized, and they do a hell of a lot of grinning and smirking. They don't give a damn if anybody knows. Well, I've taken it upon myself to try to understand and comprehend police and county sheriff sting operations as thoroughly as I possibly can. Ironically, my oldest daughter, Shauna Wagar, was recruited into these sting operations, and she was aiding and abetting the very people that were framing me, and she was aiding and abetting the very people that poisoned me. And before she moved out of this apartment, she had left behind this movie case. Let me set it down where the light came better. She left behind this before she moved out. this apartment. It's basically it's a very thick DVD movie case. Has 50. It has 50 old Western movies in this DVD case, and the majority of the movies in here. Now you can see John Wayne's on the cover of this. John Wayne is on the cover. This is pretty much basically just all Westerns, and I was quite shocked and surprised to discover that almost every single one of these Western movies that is in this case, and there's 50 of these movies. I was quite shocked and surprised to discover that almost every single one of them had a great deal of sting operations in these Western movies. Even Western movies from the 1930s, I was quite shocked and surprised to see a great deal and large, substantial amount of sting tactics that were being used within these movies. Yeah, I've highlighted some of the movies that were the most blatant in regards to sting operations. This is the pamphlet that comes with all the movies. This is the pamphlet where you can actually read an index, where you can see the names of all the movies that come with this case. And let me see if I can find some of the movies that I've highlighted here. Okay, here's one. I'm going to have to use my flashlight so it's easier to read. It says here, The Phantom Rancher, starring Ken Maynard, Dorothy Short, Harry Harvey. This movie was made in 1940, and it's a black and white, unrated movie. Now, I'll give you the description of what's in this pamphlet, and then I'll explain to you what's in this movie. Okay, the description that's in here, it says, when his uncle gunned down Ken Mitchell arrives to take over his ranch, he discovers that his uncle was murdered by Collins and his gang, who are trying to take over the ranches in the area. Mitchell wants to come to the aid of the beleaguered ranchers, but it turns out that they hated his uncle and refused to accept his charity. Ken threatens to foreclose on their properties, but by night he delivers the money they need, disguised as the Phantom Ranger. Now that's the description of the movie in this pamphlet. And now I watched this movie, The Phantom Ranger, starring Ken Maynard. This movie was made in 1940. I watched this movie, and that description doesn't even come close to describing this movie. The amount of sting operation tactics that are in this movie is substantial. Ironically, there's a great deal of poisoning going. There is actual poisoning going on in that movie, where the villains are covertly sneaking onto their target's property, and they're poisoning the cattle's water. Now, these are sting tactics that sting operations use, and every one of these tactics are covert crimes. The amount of covert crimes just in this movie, The Phantom Ranger, is astonishing. I don't know how to explain it other than to say that back in the 30s and back in the 40s, sting operations were well underway already back in those days, and were common practice back in those days. And that it was common knowledge with law enforcement and with people in government and with people involved in the movie industry, that sting operations were a common thing back in those days, and covert tactics were a common practice back in those days. The amount of sting operation tactics in that movie, Phantom Rancher, is substantial, and there's actual poisoning taking place. The people that are the bad guys in this movie are using sting tactics in targeting their targets, and the good guys in this movie are also using sting tactics to target their targets. So it's basically one long movie of nothing but sting operation tactics and covert tactics, where they're all covertly trying to screw one another over in a covert manner. I was quite surprised to see how much sting operation tactics are in this movie. Now I'm going to point out another movie that's in this pamphlet, and I'm going to have to get my flashlight so I can read it. This one is Paroled to Die, and it's starring Bob Steele, Kathleen Elliott, Carl Hackett, and it's made in 1937, and it's a black and white movie, and it's unrated. Now here's the description that's in the pamphlet here. It says, an unscrupulous banker named Harvey Moline is embezzling funds from his own bank to finance a clandestine oil drilling operation. Finding a bandana left by Doug Riffern, he arranges for his bank to be robbed and lays the blame on Doug. When our hero is convicted but released on parole, Moline plans to take him out of the picture on a permanent basis. Now, that is the description that's given of this movie, which was made in 1937. It's called Paroled to Die, and it stars Bob Steele. Now, this movie, and I have to emphasize, this movie quite literally is 100% non-stop sting operations. If you look at it from the perspective of the organized bad guys are using sting operation tactics to target the organized good guys, and the organized good guys are using sting tactics to target the organized bad guys. It's essentially just one long movie of nothing but sheer and total and complete sting operations. They're all acting, both the good guys and the bad guys are acting covertly and are trying to screw one another over. And they're all staging shit. They're all there's more staging than actual committing of anything in this movie. That's exactly what sting operations is, and for the most part all about, is they stage this, they'll stage that, they'll stage this crime, they'll stage that crime, and then they do it with the intent of blaming their target. That's exactly what a sting operation is, and that's pretty much predominantly all that's happening in that movie. And it's the good guys that are staging shit to blame the bad guys, and it's the bad guys staging shit to blame the good guys. And it's pretty much one solid movie of nothing but sting operations. And this movie was made in 1937. Now, you have to understand that in the 30s, that's the golden era of the talking movies. And what did our United States government and its propaganda arm, the propaganda machine known as our entertainment media, what did they do? They pumped out a shit ton of propaganda back in the 30s during the golden era, basically glorifying sheriffs and glorifying law enforcement and glorifying the tactics that sheriffs and law enforcement use. And they pumped out a great deal of propaganda movies that portray law enforcement as good guys and portray all of their tactics that they use as a good thing. All these golden era movies where they have sheriffs and whatnot involved and they're using sting operation tactics, they're actually glorifying it. They're trying to make it look as though it's normal and that it's justified and that the end justifies the means. In other words, it's perfectly okay for the good guys to stage 20, 30 fucking crimes for the sake of pinning one crime on their target. And that's pretty much, in a nutshell, pretty much that's what this movie, Paroled to Die, for the most part, pretty much does. The only person that actually gets killed in this movie, Paroled to Die, is one of the bad guys that's shot by the good guy. And ironically, because that person is viewed as a good guy and viewed as somebody that's buddies with the county sheriffs they demonstrate how the county sheriffs will just say, well, yeah, you're cleared, don't worry about it, there's going to be no trial, you're not going to be arrested, you're not going to be charged with jack shit, you know, I just auto-declare you cleared just because I believe what you say. And that's just bullshit. If somebody shoots somebody, there's supposed to be a trial. Only a jury can determine whether somebody's cleared or whether somebody is, guilty. The fact that, but this type of propaganda movies, where they're trying to glorify sheriffs, they're trying to glorify sting operations, and they're trying to glorify the tactics they use. They try to make it appear as though, they're free to do whatever the fuck they want, and they can clear anybody they want to without bothering with any kind of a trial. The only person that gets killed in this movie is one of the bad guys, and it's one of the good guys that kills the bad guy. And that person doesn't have to go through a trial for that at all. The sheriff just simply says, well, yeah, I believe you when you say that it was self-defense. And as though that's good enough, and then, oh, gee, nothing has to go before a court because of it. So they're trying to sell and promote not only fascism and law enforcement, but they're trying to promote and glorify the tactics they use. Now, I need to point out, and this is the actual movie I wanted to speak the most about, because this is the most blatant amount of sting operations I have ever seen in any movie. This is the year right now, 2015, and I'm like 50-something years old. Now, I've never seen these movies from the 30s and from the 40s. There's very few of these movies I ever seen as a kid growing up. Most of these movies are unofficially censored by the government and by entertainment industry, because as a kid growing up, the vast majority of these movies, I've never seen any of these movies. I never even knew these movies exist. Like, there's movies in here by Roy Rogers I've never heard of. There's movies in here by Tex Ritter I've never heard of. There's movies in here by Bob Still I've never heard of. There's movies in here by Ken Maynard I've never heard of. And that's just an example. The only person that I've actually knew before I ever started viewing any of these movies was, of course, John Wayne. Now, I want to point out and stress the fact that all the John Wayne movies that are in this collection are the ones that have the least amount of sting operations that I've witnessed. There are sting tactics in the John Wayne movies, but they're like the least amount. The John Wayne movies appear to be the more dumbed-down versions of Westerns back in the golden and silver age of the talking movies, because there's the least amount of sting operations. It's as though at a certain point, Hollywood and government themselves decided to dumb down their movies so that they're not quite so blatantly obvious sting operations. But ironically, the majority of these golden era cowboy movies, of which the majority of them, I've never even heard of these before until I got this collection. The vast amount of sting operations in them is amazing. I counted at least 26, 27 different tactics, sting tactics, that were in this movie, Paroled to Die, starring Bob Still. There's at least 26, 27 separate sting tactics. It's just one solid movie from beginning, middle to end of nothing but covert stalking of each other's targets and covertly spying on their targets and covertly staging crimes with the intent of blaming their target. That is sting operations. That's nothing but sting operations. Ironically, one of the sidekicks in this Western movie, he goes by the name of Carl Hackett. The sidekick's name in the movie is Lucky, and he's actually he himself is a sting op. As a matter of fact, he's like the biggest brains behind the good guys side of the sting operation. But throughout the entire movie, he's portrayed as the dumb dude, the sidekick, the dude you laugh at, the comical one, the comic relief type character. Ironically, he's the brains. At the end of the movie, it's revealed that he's the brains behind the whole fucking sting operation. At least for on the good guys side of the sting operation. And it's amazing and ironic the bullshit that they sell in there. He's not a sheriff. The sidekick dude, he's not a sheriff, he's not a cop, he's not a marshal. He just simply announces to everybody after they set the sting, and and the good guys are the ones staging and committing the crimes, and then they just give the bad guy the blame. And that's when the sidekick makes it known that, well, he represents the governor. And he literally says that. He represents the governor, and he was set in to set the trap in order to catch these robbers. And that's how he explains it and sells it. And everybody in the movie just acts like, well, okay, that's acceptable. Somebody represents the governor. You're supposed to recognize that as somebody that has the authority to arrest you. That's all it takes for a sting op. That's the only bullshit a sting op needs to say. And everybody falls for that line of bullshit. But that's a perfect example of sting operations, because sting ops will stage and commit any pretense for the purpose of setting up their target to get the blame for something, or to frame their target for something. They'll stage and commit any bullshit, nonsense, pretense, and they'll just pretend they're justified. I can't stress enough, if you ever want to learn about sting operations, I cannot stress enough to get that movie, even though it's a Western movie. It's made in 1937, made back in the golden era. I flat out tell you, this movie is non-stop, from beginning, middle to end, non-stop sting tactics. It's an amazing amount of sting tactics in there. If you replace all the horses with cars, when you watch this movie, if you just imagine they're driving cars instead of riding horses, and just pay attention and count the tactics they're using in targeting one another, you will be amazed and shocked at the amount of sting tactics that are in this movie. It's one of the most blatant examples of sting operations I've ever seen in a movie. I've never seen this movie as a kid growing up. That movie has never been rerun on local television here where I live in Portland, Oregon. I've never even seen most of the vast majority of these movies before until this collection was given to me. I never even heard of these movies. Now, I know that people back in the 30s and 40s knew of these movies, and I'm sure seen these movies, but these movies were never rerun on TV. And so people from the 50s and 60s and 70s have never heard of, let alone seen these movies. Including me. I never even knew these movies existed. But if you want to learn about sting operations and learn about how and keep in mind, don't view the good guys as the good guys. Don't view the bad guys as the bad guys. Just view what's happening in this movie as one organized group is using sting tactics to target another organized group, and that other organized group is using sting tactics to target that organized group. So if you look at it from that perspective, and don't ignore the tactics the good guys are using and just count the bad guys' tactics. Count both the bad guys' tactics as well as the good guys' tactics, and it will be a complete listing, literally, of police and county sheriff type sting operations. This is quite literally non-stop sting operations. They even demonstrate in this movie how court trials, are completely meaningless and irrelevant to sting operations, because the bad guys use sting tactics to frame the good guy to go to prison. And then the good guy's sting operation allowed the good guy to be convicted without really fighting back or proving anything in court. And then after the good guy is convicted, well, the sting operation just exercised their fascist power to have him automatically and immediately paroled. Thus, and they basically flaunt this power and demonstrate this power and demonstrate how, well, courts and verdicts and convictions are utterly meaningless to sting operations powers, because sting operations is all a game for sting operatives and sting operations, because they'll stage this, they'll stage that, they'll stage 20, 30 different fucking crimes for the sole purpose of pinning one crime on their target. And they quite literally demonstrate as well in this movie that courts and trials and testimony and verdicts and convictions are completely and utterly and totally meaningless and pointless and nothing more than a part of the game for sting operations. Because the good guy was framed for a crime by the bad guys, and the sting operation on the good guy's side literally let the good guy get convicted just for the sole purpose of essentially lowering the guard of the bad guys. And then after the bad guy's guard is lowered, well, then the good guy sting operation just literally just paroled outright. Just literally outright just paroled the good guy that was convicted, thus nullifying and voiding the trial and the testimony and the verdict and the conviction. So they're just demonstrating in this movie how trials, testimony, verdicts, and convictions are completely and utterly and totally meaningless to sting operations, because all sting operations care about is setting the stage, setting up their targets, getting their targets to blame, and making sure that the blame sticks on them. And that's all sting operations really care about. And this movie demonstrates it outright. It just, all it took was the dude that's the brains behind the good guy side of the sting operation, who happens to be the comic relief in the movie. He's quite literally, he justifies it all by simply saying, "I represent the governor. He sent me in here to set the trap." And that's all it takes, and that's the only justification they need, apparently. And that's how they, and you know what, I've seen so much bullshit from sting operations and sting operatives that I actually honestly believe back in those days, back in the 30s, there are probably people that would fall for that bullshit. Oh, I represent the governor. Well, we were sent in to set the trap. Oh, I bet there's people back in the 30s that actually fucking fell for that kind of bullshit nonsense. But this movie demonstrates in great detail, how sting operations work and how almost everything they do is all about them staging the crimes for the purpose of pinning the blame on their target. And that's essentially all. That's really what a sting operation is. And there's like two sting operations in this movie, because the bad guys are a sting operation and they're targeting the good guys, and the good guys are a sting operation and they're targeting the bad guys. And both the good guys and the bad guys are both using sting tactics to target one another. And ironically, the only person that is a killer in the movie is the good guy, the star of the movie, Bob Still. Because he's the only one that kills anybody in this entire movie. And there is no trial for that. As a matter of fact, the sheriff outright tells the star of the movie, Bob Still, that, oh yeah, well, he's clear. No proof, no testimony, no jack shit, just the sheriff declaring, oh yeah, you're clear. That's good enough. Oh, this is blatantly nothing. This movie is blatantly nothing but sheer sting operations. Now, there's more movies in here I want to point out. I would like to talk more about this Probe to Die movie. As a matter of fact, that would be the one I would want to focus on the most. But there's other movies I want to point out. There's this one here called Billy the Kid Trapped. Billy the Kid Trapped. And I'm going to read the description that it has in here. And to keep in mind, this description is important because I'm going to tell you that they give you the actual description after I'm done reading this bogus description that they have in this pamphlet. Billy the Kid Trapped, starring Buster Crabbe, Al St. John, Glenn Strange. The movie was made in 1942. It's black and white and it's unrated. The description says, outlaw gang leader Stanton stages a jailbreak for Billy the Kid and his sidekicks Fuzzy and Jeff. But Stanton has a hidden agenda for Billy and his partners. He and his gang plan to go on a spree of robbery and murder, laying the blame on our unsuspecting threesome. Now, that is a very vague description. The movie, once again, is called Billy the Kid Trapped, and starring Buster Crabbe. It was made in 1942. This movie, it doesn't have a substantial amount of sting tactics in it, but it does have sting tactics in it. Virtually every single movie that's in this collection literally has sting tactics in it. I'm just pointing out the most extreme ones, essentially. The reason I'm pointing out Billy the Kid, and I hope you notice that there's the use of doubles in this movie, Billy the Kid Trapped. They're using doubles to stage and commit crimes for the purpose of framing the targets. Now, once again, you have these old golden and silver era westerns. They have the good guys and they have the bad guys. And both the good guys and both the bad guys are organized. And they're like a gang. They're each like a gang. And they're each using sting tactics to target one another. Well, in this particular movie, their main tool that they're using in framing their targets is the use of doubles. the bad guys in this movie are doubling and impersonating the three stars, the three good guys in this movie. And they're doing it with the intent of framing the good guys for murders and for robberies and high felony crimes. And they're not doing it because they're not getting away with it because they're exact lookalikes. They're just dressing up like the good guys. Basically, they just dress up like the good guys, and then they just stage a bank robbery. They put a mask on, and then they stage a robbery, or they commit a murder. And then the good guys just get the blame, because the people that are committing the crimes look like Billy the Kid and his two sidekicks. I'm stressing this because I already know, and I'm already aware of the fact that law enforcement, to this day and age, in 2015, regularly uses doubles to stage and commit crimes. And they usually have their civilian operatives to back up the complaints on the targets. That's how the Portland Police and Multnomah County Sheriffs were setting me up for crimes. My wife and her side of the family was recruited into this thing, and they were setting me up for crimes, and they were using somebody in law enforcement, somebody that is a close lookalike, but not necessarily a twin or anything like that to me, but somebody that closely resembles me. And then the person just dressed up like me and would stage and commit crimes, and they would take deliberate side photos and back photos of the dude while the dude impersonated me. And this is how they were staging and committing crimes with the intent of framing me. Well, this movie was made, Billy the Kid Trapped, it's essentially more sting operations, where the sting operation is tactics that are being used against Billy the Kid and his sidekicks are the bad guys are using doubles to impersonate them and to stage and commit the crimes with the intent of giving all the blame to Billy the Kid and his partners, his sidekicks. So for this purpose, I've included this. There's not a huge amount of sting operations taking place in this movie. It's mainly just the use of doubles. It's like constant use of doubles in this movie, which that in and of itself is a very huge tactic that sting operations back in the 30s and back in the 40s and to this very day in 2015 still use. And this movie is demonstrating it. So back in the 30s and back in the 40s, it was known back in those days that they can easily dress up like somebody that they're targeting and then stage or commit a crime, and then it's easy for them to just pin the blame on their target. And that's essentially what is taking place in that movie. And it's blatantly a sting operation tactic, and I'm a first-hand witness to the fact that the use of doubles by law enforcement, sting operations, do indeed on a regular basis stage and commit crimes using lookalikes for the sole purpose of making their target look like a bad guy. This movie was made in 1940. And I would like to point out all these movies, all the writers of these movies that wrote the stories and wrote the screenplays, they're generally people that back in those days were in law enforcement or were connected to law enforcement. So essentially, when in the golden era, when talkie movies were invented and the new medium of talkie movies started being propagated by Hollywood, and the government obviously funding and directing and controlling the type of propaganda that was being pumped out, they're coming up with entertainment stories, entertainment/adventure stories, and they're coming up with these stories by using actual sting tactics that they already know about and are already known to use, and they're simply incorporating these sting tactics into fictional stories for the purpose of entertainment. And they're doing it with the intent of glorifying it and glorifying the tactics that law enforcement use and to promote the tactics law enforcement use. And it's basically a ton of propaganda that's designed to glorify law enforcement and the tactics that law enforcement uses And that's essentially what is taking place with all these movies in general. Now, I pointed that movie out because there's a blatant use of doubles that are staging and committing crimes for the purpose of framing their target, and that is definitely a sting tactic of which I'm a first-hand witness of. Okay, here's another movie worthy of pointing out. It's called Arizona Stagecoach. It's starring Ray Crash Kerrigan, John Dusty King, Max Taroon. The movie was made in 1942. It's black and white, and it's unrated. Now, this movie is very much, there's a great deal of sting operation tactics that are in this movie as well. There's also, ironically, there's also propaganda, blatant fascist propaganda that's in this movie. And I was quite surprised to see it, considering the year that the movie was made. The movie was made in 1942. And this movie was aimed at, this movie is mostly aimed at as entertainment for children back in 1942. And they have a talking dummy where one of the people that operate the dummy is acting as a ventriloquist for the dummy. And ironically, they have swastikas surrounding the dummy. They have Nazi swastikas surrounding the dummy in this movie. I was quite surprised to see that, considering that this movie was made in the United States of America, and it was made in 1942. I do believe that the United States of America was at war with Nazi Germany and with Japan in 1942. I was quite surprised to see that they were promoting fascism and promoting the fascist Nazis in this movie. The amount of sting operations that are in this movie is quite a bit, but it's not enough. I'm not going to go into an explanation for it, but there is quite a bit of sting operation tactics in here. Once again, you have. It is ironically in this movie you have a target who's a good guy, and he's not organized, and he's not even necessarily connected to the good guys or really connected to the bad guys. He's just the target. He's a good guy, but he's an individual, and he has a sister, and she's not connected to the good guys or the bad guys. And what happens is this individual is being set up to get the blame for robbery. And it's the bad guys that committed the robbery that are setting him up to get the blame. And the good guys end up using sting tactics themselves in order to, and start committing and staging crimes themselves with the intent of framing, blaming the bad guys, ironically. So, ironically, in this movie, you'll see the bad guys near the beginning of the movie literally robbing like a stagecoach. And later in the movie, and then they frame and blame this individual who is innocent, but they're pinning the blame on this innocent person. And then later in the movie, you'll see the good guys doing the exact same thing as the bad guys. At the beginning of the movie, the bad guys are putting on masks and they rob a stagecoach. Well, after this good guy individual is framed to get the blame, these organized good guys, they're doing the exact same things the bad guys are doing. They're putting on masks. They're putting on black wardrobe. They're essentially impersonating the bad guys, and then the good guys rob a stagecoach. So, what does that tell you? You know, that should tell you something. So there's a great deal of the good guys themselves in this Western movie, Arizona Stagecoach, made in 1942. The
good guys are quite literally mimicking the bad guys and are staging the same crimes that the bad guys are staging. Now, in the end, the bad guys go to prison and the good guys get no jail time at all. But gee, the good guys are staging the exact same crimes as the bad guys are in this movie, and ironically, they don't go to prison for jack shit. It's all about, it's all about them staging crimes for the purpose of blaming their targets. Once again, I'm amazed at the sheer amount of sting operations that are in these old Western movies. It's amazing. They have, by the 50s and 60s and 70s, man, did they majorly dumb down Western movies, because back in the 30s and early 40s, man, the amount of sting operations in the golden era Westerns, it's just fucking amazing how much staging and committing of crimes that are committed for the sole purpose of blaming and framing and pinning the blame on their targets. It's just staggering. I mean, gee, the very people that are the writers for Hollywood, the biggest propaganda machine in the United States of America back in the 30s and 40s, gee, what is their mindsets on? Staging and committing crimes in organized fashions for the sole purpose of pinning the blame and framing and blaming their targets. That's what's on their fucking minds, and it's like almost every one of these movies from the 30s and 40s has these tactics. Literally, they have these tactics in these movies. And ironically, this particular movie is promoting fucking fascism. It's promoting Nazism, because they have a talking dummy in this goddamn movie with the movie called Arizona Stagecoach. It has Crash Currigan starring in it. The Range Busters. It has the Range Busters are the ones. The three stars in the movie are called the Range Busters in this movie. They're actually promoting fucking fascism. They're freaking, during World War II, they're actually promoting fucking Nazism and fascism in this movie. This is an American movie made in America. It's like, Jesus fucking Christ. Now there's another movie I wanted to point out. White Comanche. Now, this movie is starring Joseph Cotton, William Shatner, Rosanna Yanni, and the movie is made in 1968. It's a color movie, and it's unrated. Now, I was born in 1965, so I was only like 3 years old when this movie was made. This movie has William Shatner, for the most part, starring in it. It's not a very good Western. There's very little actual sting tactics in this movie. It's a good example of how, man, did they dumb down the Westerns when government decided, gee, we need to stop promoting sting tactics. We need to conceal sting tactics. So there's very little actual sting tactics taking place in here, other than one thing and one thing only. And this is the reason why I'm including this in this description, because they're using doubles. Now, in this particular movie, they have essentially you have twin brothers. William Shatner plays the part of both brothers, and he plays a good brother and he plays an evil brother. And the evil brother commits and stages crimes, and then the good brother ends up getting the blame. So the good brother wants to have a showdown with his evil brother for the purpose of resolving this issue once and for all, because they can't both coexist, because the good brother is constantly getting the blame for everything that the bad brother does. Now, this is a very dumbed down movie compared to the westerns made back in the 30s and 40s. There's very little actual sting operations in this movie, but it is a good reference and a good example and reference to demonstrate how they did in fact dumb down the westerns to the point where sting operation tactics became almost zero in western movies. So at some point Hollywood and government itself made the decision to dumb down the movies and stop promoting sting tactics, stop promoting all this organized staging for the purpose of pinning blame on targets, because they want the general public to be ignorant of such tactics. So there's very little actual sting operations at all in this movie, but there is, once again, the use of doubles, and innocent people are getting the blame for what doubles are committing, for the crimes that doubles are committing in this movie. So that is a sting tactic, and that's literally the only sting tactics that's in this movie. But because they're using doubles to blame innocent people, it's worthy of pointing out, and that's the only reason I'm pointing it out. Now, there's one more movie. I have to go quickly because my cell phone will cut off on me any minute. I'm running out of time. This cell phone will only record for like 60 minutes, and then it just cuts out on me without warning. And I'm reaching the 60-minute mark. I'm nearing it. Okay, this movie here, Tex Rides with the Boy Scouts. This movie is starring Tex Ritter, Marjorie Reynolds, Horace Murphy. The movie is made in 1937. It's a black and white, unrated movie. Now, I'll give you the description of this movie. G-Man Tex Ritter is working on a case involving a train robbery and the gold shipment that was taken from it, when one of the henchmen cashes in some of the gold nuggets. Tex and his assistant are able to narrow their search for suspects. Tex recruits the local Boy Scout troop to assist him with tracking the suspects as they move the stolen goods shipment and aid in their capture. Now, that's the description that is given for this movie. Now, I want to point out there's a substantial, this movie made in 1937, Tex Rides with the Boy Scouts. There is a substantial amount of sting operations in this movie. Basically, it's law enforcement and Boy Scouts working together using sting tactics to target and to stalk their targets. It's basically 1930s propaganda that promotes the fascist organization known as the Boy Scouts. You have to understand that you have to understand back in the 30s, fascism was pretty freaking open in many countries, including the United States of America. And there was a great deal of propaganda being pumped by fascist countries in promoting fascism. Well, this movie is promoting law enforcement and is promoting the Boy Scouts and is promoting the fact that they work together in sting operation tactics for the purpose of targeting their targets. Now, this movie has a great deal, a substantial amount of sting-type tactics that are used, a great deal of stalking, a great deal of trespass and stalking that occurs in this movie. And it's mostly, throughout the majority of the movie, not counting the actual robbery that's committed by the bad guys. The vast majority of actual crimes that are taking place in this movie are actually crimes committed by Tex Ritter, the good guys, and by the Boy Scouts, because they're constantly stalking their targets and they're constantly trespassing. So, without warrants, and they're doing so with guns. So, the majority of crimes that are actually taking place in this movie are actually being committed by the good guys, and it's all organized sting tactics. This movie is a propaganda movie because it heavily promotes the Boy Scouts in a very propagandistic manner.
much in the same way as the Nazis promoted their fascist agenda back in the 30s. The same manner of promoting is being used in this movie to promote the Boy Scouts. You have to understand that children, even this is the year right now, 2015. The children in this day and age, to this very day and age, are regularly used by law enforcement in sting operations. Well, here's a movie where law enforcement is using children, but only Boy Scout children, special children, privileged children, not normal children, but privileged upper-class children in sting operations to target law enforcement's targets. And the crimes that law enforcement and the children that they use in these sting operation tactics, they're not held accountable for anything. So it demonstrates how organized sting operations are organized and how they operate in an organized fashion for the purpose of targeting their targets. And any and all crimes committed by the so-called good guys that are using criminal activities in the targeting of their targets, those crimes are completely ignored and not addressed and just utterly ignored. And everybody just ignores the fact that, law enforcement and the Boy Scouts, they work together in framing and targeting people. And they'll stage 20, 30 crimes just to pin one crime on their target. And that's essentially what is taking place. Now, the bad guys in this movie are guilty of robbery. They stole like $1 million in gold. So they're guilty of that crime, essentially, in this movie. But all the rest of the crimes that are taking place in the movie, which is the vast majority of the movie, is the trespassing and the stalking that's being taken place by the good guys and by the Boy Scouts themselves, who are stalking and targeting their targets. They're constantly trespassing, they're constantly stalking, both of which are crimes, and they're doing it in an organized fashion, which amounts to organized criminal conspiracy. And they're doing so illegally. But they're promoting it as a good thing. They're promoting it as normal. They're promoting it as, hey, anything law enforcement and anybody they recruit to help them, anything they do is justified. That's how they want people to come away from these movies, from these stories. And it's very much a propagandistic movie because it's heavily promoting the Boy Scouts in a very fascist manner. It's essentially promoting fascism. And the Boy Scouts are fascist, very fascist. Just because people don't openly point that out, don't change the fact. That's what the Boy Scouts are. People that are Boy Scouts, they usually grow up to become community leaders. They become police officers. They become county sheriff officers. They become people that they make up the people that embed your government, essentially, and run your government. Now, is that enough to know that the Boy Scouts is of a privileged class of people? They're not normal people. They're a privileged class of people. They're the people that get jobs as managers at corporations. They're the people that grow up to run banks, not work at banks, but to run banks. Okay, so the whole point of the Boy Scouts was a fascist movement to organize the privileged class of people in the United States of America into higher positions of authority in this country. And it's essentially a form of fascism. And this movie glorifies it and tries to portray it as a good thing, when it's just nothing more than just more organized fascism. Now, in this day and age, I really have very little opinion of the Boy Scouts. My opinion essentially is the same as my opinion of the Boy Scouts back in the 30s, for the most part. But they're more open to accepting, normal children into Boy Scouts than they were back in the 30s. So they're more tolerant of having just, average children in the Boy Scouts. But for the most part, the Boy Scouts make up, essentially, the people that actually run your government. And you know what? To this very day and age, in 2015, your news media and your Hollywood movies and whatnot, they all try to hide that back from everybody. The vast majority of people that are in law enforcement and have a lifetime career of usually staying and being in law enforcement, they're usually people that grew up as Boy Scouts.
That should tell you something. They're from a separate class of people. They're not normal people. They're raised very differently than normal children. They're raised very fascist-mindedly. They're raised to think they're better than everybody else. They're raised to think